Okay, so sorry for the technical issues. Yeah, but here we are. So I think we're live, probably live. Welcome everyone to the 7th talk in this new series convened by Mladi za podnebno pravičnost, or Youth for Climate Justice Slovenia. So the idea behind this series is to invite guests for collective sense-making, futures envisioning, and strategy building in solidarity, to build the insights and tools to unmake capitalism for ourselves, each other, future generations, and those considered non-human others, and to co-create the conditions and structures for co-creating just futures. And today, I'm very happy and excited to be welcoming two guests, Christoph Görg and Ulrich Brand. And instead of me talking about their achievements and such, we agreed maybe, you both could introduce yourself briefly at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Rock, and thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure for me to be virtual in Ljubljana. I was there only 2 years ago for this political ecology conference, and I really enjoyed being there and having these discussions at the conference, and also enjoying Ljubljana as a city. I'm trained social scientist, working since 5 years at the Institute of Social-Ecology in Vienna. Currently, I'm head of the institute. I worked there for a long time also in Germany, first at the University of Frankfurt, then at the University of Kassel, and also in Leipzig, the Helmholtz Institute for Environmental Research. I'm engaged in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research since 20 years or so, and currently mostly focus on this issue of socio-ecological transformation. And it's also my approach to understand that we are not concerned with the corona pandemic. And I'm happy to introduce, to present some theses about this corona crisis later on.
Yes, hello, my name is Uli Brand, Dobar dan. I'm happy to be with you. I'm working at the University of Vienna. I come originally also from Germany. I have a long trajectory working with Christoph Görg. We are also good friends, and I'm happy that we have this common session here. I work in the field of international politics, social ecological transformation, very close to Christoph, and political ecology. Also, I'm one of the organizers, the co-organizers with many others, and with Christoph for the Degrowth conference in upcoming end of May. And I'm very close to ATTAC, the network of the Alter Globalization Network in Germany and Austria. I was several times at the World Social Forum after the year 2000. And beside the common work with Christoph, one of my further topics is Latin America and the critique of resource extractivism, how to understand these dynamics. But this won't be an issue today. We will focus much more on our realities in Europe. And thank you to Rock and to Matek, also in the name of Christoph and me, that you set up this.
Thank you so much. And yes, Matej is our go-to guy for the technical setup, so shout out for him. So how we envisioned this today's session. So just to note maybe that before this session, we shared with our followers some of your works, some of your shared more recent articles, one on challenges for socio-ecological transformations, and one on overcoming neoliberal globalization and transformations from a Polanyian perspective. And we also made it a point to share your lecture, Christoph, 2 years ago at our summer school. Maybe just a little recap of what we've been discussing with other guests so far in this series. We talked about degrowth and a rise of authoritarianism with Vincent Lich, and a bit with Dan Brian Gideon on social ecology, and of course with Ariel Saleh and Vandana Shiva on ecofeminism, and a few others like Saskia Sassen and so forth. But especially when it comes to degrowth, social ecology, also ecofeminism, and generally radical praxis for transformation, I think we can use these and interweave them in our discussion and hear your takes on these subjects and how you place them within your conceptual apparatus for how to co-create just futures. So yeah, we would discuss a little bit about this, of course, also the corona situation, or however you'd like to frame this and reflect on it from your perspectives. And also it would be great to reflect a little bit on current situation, political situation in Slovenia, also in line with a protest that's happening today that Mladi za podnebno pravičnost are helping co-organize. So yeah, at this point, maybe I would give the word to Christoph to maybe explore a little bit the coronavirus situation and its implications for social political ecology, thinking through these fields.
Yeah, thank you, Rock, for this. For organizing this and for inviting us. What I have prepared for today are some theses about the corona pandemic from a perspective of the social ecology. From my perspective, it's really a social ecological crisis in a narrow sense. And I want to emphasize this in dealing with 5 theses. The first thesis is about the issue of uncertainty. That's a very important issue, but it's not so much examined now. The uncertainty does not only depend on the quality of the scientific diagnosis or the rationality of the political decision makers. It's directly related to the specific character of the crisis, which can neither be reduced to a medical scientific problem, nor to an exceptional social situation, but rather represent a socio-ecological crisis in a narrow sense. And it consists quite generally in the interactions of the biophysical and social processes, namely of the fact that a virus, so far poorly understood, should be contained in its effects on the social processes by political measures, which are contested both in efficiency and its legitimacy. Neither expertise from natural scientists nor from social sciences alone can fully grasp the very nature of this crisis. This means the socio-ecological crisis. Secondly, it's not only a crisis, it's a socio-ecological insult or affront against humanity and human thinking. Very recently, measures to contain the crisis show effects in some countries, but until now, we are far away from being successful at the end. In reverse, it is completely unclear yet what could be an end of the pandemic at all. There's a strong hope in a vaccine, but it can take several years to develop effective medicine or vaccine. As a result, the uncertainties about the best way to react leads to an increasing impatience. This impatience has many phases. For example, the strong hope for normality in many countries, or even a total denial of the threat itself. Also, you can observe this in many countries. From a socio-ecological perspective, I would argue that the impatience over or even indignations about the virus emerge from what I would like to call a socio-ecological insult. An insult that human beings still suffer from such a microorganism. Recently, a new geological age has been proclaimed, the Anthropocene, as the human age, human Earth age. It now turns out that this species, the human being, cannot even control a microorganism. Unfortunately, the current reaction to this insult does not yet provide insights that could help to learn from this crisis. Rather, the dominant response are attempts to control the pandemic by science and technology, that is, by medicine. But it's one of the great illusions uncovered in this crisis yet, that despite technical progress in science and medicine, despite the Anthropocene and the supposed uniqueness of the human species, it still remains an organism which is subject to the same causal relationship like other organisms. The third thesis is about the war against the crisis, and this is, from my perspective, a strategy of mastery of nature. It has become common to speak of a war against the virus, which must be won. It is precisely this framing that not only misses the character of the crisis, but also leads to a fatal reaction that tend to worsen the crisis. The idea that a dangerous microorganism which threatens human societies, like war, is not only a projection, of human behavior onto a microorganism, that means an anthropomorphism. It also misses in societies and the non-human nature. That means the socio-ecological character of the crisis. The interactions between the virus and humans only becomes a crisis because the host animal, the human body, can and does defend itself. Otherwise, it would be maybe only an insignificant episode in natural evolution. And natural evolution, this is always not a harmonious coexistence of living beings. But because the host organism, we, does not want to give in, because it even thinks it is something special, it has dubbed itself the crown of creation, only recently secularized to the Anthropocene. The interaction between the two organisms is different. Humans fight the virus because they do not see themselves as part of a natural process, but rather as something special. Because they have technical and medical possibilities to design the interactions between virus and host animals differently. That is, and I would like to emphasize this, quite understandable. Even it puts a limit on the optimistic assessments of conviviality, the coexistence of people and non-human beings. However, it is precisely this contradiction between a species seeing itself as something exceptional, as superior to other species because of its ability to master nature, and the reality that this organism is threatened in its national existence by such a small virus, which further stimulates the global crisis. Perhaps uncovering this illusion could be a beneficial outcome of the crisis. It could be called the fourth great insult of man, after the first three insults associated with the names of Copernicus, Darwin, and Freud. Had they questioned the uniqueness of man in the universe, in nature, and as a sovereign self, the crisis manifests the loss of the uniqueness of man as a natural being, precisely despite, or rather because, of its scientific and technical potentials that obviously do not much help him. What is called the war against the virus is nothing more than an attempt to deny this insult. A completely different starting point can be gained if somebody emphasizes the societal, socio-ecological character of the crisis-like interactions in the relationships between society and nature. The fourth thesis is a perspective from social ecology. I would argue that the dynamics of the crisis and the associated uncertainties can be better understood from a social ecological approach. A crisis is not only a situation in which the cause of an illness is decided, whether you recover or go back to life, or whether your mortality increases and maybe you go to death. A crisis is also a situation which appears to a subject as an inevitable predicament. When the economy is in crisis, then the problem can no longer be denied. Then the need for an appropriate response is seen as inevitable. Whether it is actually a crisis may be controversial or denied in individual cases. And what is still to be done is much more controversial, but something has to be done, and that seems evident when one speaks about a crisis. My colleagues Jürgen Becker and Thomas Jahn, together with their colleagues from the Institute of Socio-Ecological Research in Frankfurt, spoke more than 30 years ago of a crisis of societal relations with nature. Such an ecological crisis, however, is not just about the phenomena that causes environmental problems, for example, anthropogenic global warming, but also a crisis of the knowledge involved, including the scientific knowledge. The corona pandemic not only proves the validity of this diagnosis, but also shows in a particularly drastic way that it is precisely the interplay between the material crisis dimensions and the linguistic knowledge of these material dimensions that is at the core of the crisis. The interplay between the biophysical dimensions of society-nature interactions and the symbolic linguistic dimensions, or more precisely, between the interdependencies in the biophysical world, including the human body, and the knowledge and non-knowledge of these causalities. Here I come to my fifth crisis. the emergence of a crisis of civilization. The controversy surrounding a loosening of countermeasures have been taking place in many countries since Easter has clearly shown that social reactions to actual or even supposed threats does not necessarily have anything to do with the real dangers, but are influenced by a variety of factors of subjective perceptions, particular fears, but also the suppression of fears, as well as prevailing patterns of thought and social interests, economic, political, and geostrategic interests. And in particular, geostrategic interests strongly emerging between China and the US, for example. Thus, the increase in racism, anti-Semitism, fake news, and conspiracy theories, which are on the rise in all countries, even within media, that were so far serious papers. At the same time, we are increasingly dependent on the expert knowledge of biologists and epidemiologists, and the discussion in the public, including the internet. What follows are deep-rooted beliefs, either in the omnipotence of science, the capacity to master the virus at one hand, but increasingly authoritarian political responses in the other. But both are only two sides of the same coin, a misleading understanding of the crisis. What concerns me most about the crisis today are these political tendencies. Humanity is not threatened in its existence, nor probably is capitalism collapsing. But capitalism is being driven into increasingly authoritarian forms due to the reaction patterns, the subjective fears, and the societal power relations. National strategies dominate, which refer to global solidarity only as a lip service, if at all. And these strategies have so far undermined any hope for positive development. Rather, the minimum conditions of a reasonable, civilized living together must be defended. Just think of the perfection of the surveillance state, which is now being developed or even implemented in many countries. The fight against the virus, this war metaphor, is increasingly used as a basis for legitimizing authoritarian restructuring of the state and society. And this makes me doubt about the hope that crisis could really stimulate a socio-ecological transformation. But maybe I'm too skeptical, and we can leave this to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christoph. And speaking of that, and noticing Ulrich taking down notes profusely, maybe I'll give him a chance to respond and give his own take.
Yes, hello, everybody. I'm also very happy to be in this conversation with you. And I hope that you had a chance or will have a chance to read the two articles. I won't refer to them. I just want to highlight that Christoph's and my background is not so much Polanyi. This was a work because we were invited to work on this, but much more Antonio Gramsci, Nikos Poulantzas, critical state theory, critical political economy. And my take for the next 10 to 12 minutes is to look more from a perspective of hegemony and counter-hegemony, to look at the ambivalences of what is taking place today. And I would like to emphasize one point Christoph just made, which is the crisis of societal nature relations has always a material and a symbolic aspect, which is key for political ecology or social ecology. And this might also help us to understand better the current situation, and Christoph already talked on this. 6 months ago, last fall, we couldn't have imagined that the climate crisis will go again off the top agenda. It was on the top agenda, and we all expected, particularly from the climate justice movement, from critical thinking, from social political ecology, that now it will stay, and that Ursula von der Leyen, when she started the presidency of the European Union, of the Commission, she presented the European Green Deal. Of course, it's a very top-down agenda. It's very much in favor of European capitals, of transnationals, but it also, we were discussing whether there are some progressive elements we could also use and to open some space for a social ecological transformation or some initiatives. But now it's very different. We have the corona crisis, and let's start, because I'm not the optimist this afternoon. The pandemic will have very, very destructive consequences. And it already has, of course, as we see, and Christoph also mentioned this, and even more for the Global South. You had Vandana Shiva in your talks and others. The drama, I work on Latin America, as I said, and it's very dramatic how governments respond, but also how the weak health systems in many countries of the Global South are already under pressure. Even the real outbreak of the pandemic is not so strong. So what I want to do is preparing a conversation among us from a critical leftist perspective to look what are defensive political initiatives, but also maybe where can we use, and not in a naive sense, but where we can use maybe some ambiguities we are living currently and which might become important for a social ecological transformation. So it's not naivety. There will be fierce struggles, and there are already fierce struggles. Think about the bailouts discussion. My point is, and I will also go through 5 aspects, it's by chance that I also 5 theses, that we need, from a critical leftist perspective, in a situation where the critical forces are quite weak, we need very particular initiatives. And you have today also your manifestation in Ljubljana, or maybe also across Slovenia, these initiatives which open up again the space for a further development. So my 5 points are very briefly. I just finished an article on this, and I thought a lot about this in the midst of the crisis. The first is, of course, the role of the state. A crisis is always the moment of governments, the moments of the executive, and the declaration of the state of emergency, the surveillance state in the making, as Christoph said, or Maristela Swampa, a sociologist from Argentina, she talks about a health leviathan. A health leviathan that is really claiming control in more and more spheres of life. Imagine that Chancellor Kurz in Austria announced that maybe you can only travel if you have a vaccine. Yeah, this would be one aspect of the health leviathan. We see the weakening of the opposition, the weakening of the parliaments, that the rescue money goes almost undisputed through, and this means again a privatization of the gains, and now it's the socialization or the statization of the losses. The Süddeutsche Zeitung, the German daily, published some weeks ago an article that 70% of the rescue money in Germany, it's 19 billion euro. 70% goes only to 19 companies. And when the parliament, the Green Party in the German Bundestag asked the government who will get the money, the Ministry of Finance said, we can't tell you because we have the private law, the Aktienrecht, the law of the shareholders. We can't tell you who will get the money. So we have this weakening, we have the intransparency, but we have also, this would be the ambiguity, a public debate, the state is back. Of course, from critical theory, you always said the state was there and there is a transformation of the state. But I would say we shouldn't underestimate from a political perspective that many people, again, believe in the capacity of the state to do something, that there is more room of maneuver than, let's say, a year ago. When we claimed a more radical climate policy, it was told us, no, there is no room for maneuver because of competitiveness, because of the power of capital and whatever, and we have to secure the jobs. But now there is some movement. So this would be the first ambiguity. And the initiative would be to hold the state in public discourses, also through progressive parties, responsible to stabilize after the crisis, whatever after the crisis means. Christoph pointed to this as well, to stabilize social infrastructures and not only the large industry. To have, as we can say with the foundational economy collective, an economy of the everyday. And this becomes now very, very open, that the economy of the everyday, the health, the provisioning of everyday life becomes more important. So this would be the first aspect. The second comes to big business. We have now, if we look at the German or the worldwide automotive industry, which was already in 2019 in crisis, the sales went down. but what we can see is, at the one hand, a degrowth by disaster, a shutdown mainly of commodity change. It's not a financial crisis what we are experiencing. It's a shutdown of commodity change, which is part of the economic crisis. But at the same time, we all know that Trump was forcing Ford and General Motors to produce medical apparatuses and others. So the ambiguity here would be, and where we could be initiative, is what Joseph Stiglitz mentioned, a new form of deglobalization. What we currently experience is a very disastrous form of deglobalization, but coming from the outer globalization movement, and some of the audience maybe as well, there was the famous term by Warden Bellow, coined in 2002, 2004, of an progressive deglobalization that leaves room for regional and local production. Of course, this could also be a game of capital. Yeah, capital also may be re-Europeanized in a sense, given the current crisis. But the task of critical forces is to make this deglobalization really democratic, and not also only in the name of capital and in light of the power. So I'm not familiar with the conditions in Slovenia, but for Austria and Germany, one crucial initiative would be currently concerning the companies to link the bailouts with social and ecological criteria. Yeah, with working time reductions, with the conversion of the automotive industry, with taxes of airplane tickets, with a reduction of European air traffic and others. This would be, I close the second point here, the initiative. The third ambiguity is the everyday, the mode of living, the experience of the mode of living. Christoph and I are always a bit chatting that we live quite well in the current situation. Because we don't have duties. We have a stable income, we can work from the home office, we don't have care duties. But for many people, it's really disastrous. Homeschooling, the flexibilization comes back probably in Slovenia much more than in Austria or Germany, that people are losing the jobs and so on. So there's a lot of fear, a lot of precarity, a lot of uncertainty, but there might be also some elements of what I would call with Markus Wissen against the imperial mode of living, a mode of living in solidarity. It's not naive again, but to have a sense that in this summer probably we won't. People are not flying all over the world for holidays, or that the production will localize again and others. This might be some contours, some very decent aspects of an solidarity mode of living against the imperial mode of living. We should discuss it very carefully, and but I would insist. The fourth point, I can be very brief because Christoph already did it. It's the question of uncertainty, of vulnerability, that it's socially recognized that human beings are not the autonomous subjects that try to optimize their interest and their utility, but that we are part of nature, that human beings are part of societal nature relations in a very concrete system. And we now have a very politicized health system, which was not thinkable a year ago. Yeah, the privatization or the cutback of the health system, but we can see that it's now politicized, and that again it might come to a broader discussion of the everyday economy and others. And Christoph mentioned this as well. There's an interesting debate that the coronavirus has to do with also with capitalist societal nature relations, with the monocultures, the industrialization of agriculture, the destruction of biodiversity, of natural livelihoods and others. My fifth point, and then I close to stay also within my time, is what I would call the crisis of progressive multilateral politics. And this is not new, but in the current crisis, the responses are mainly at the national level, with a bit an exception of the European Union. But if you look worldwide, it's really not only America comes first, Austria comes first, probably Slovenia comes first, Germany comes first. And the richer countries, they can afford bailouts, but the bailouts will lead, as in the crisis 10 years ago, to a further concentration of capital worldwide, as we experience in the European Union in the crisis 2008-2009. That the German capital, Austrian capital, they took advantage. So, it's very obvious that the fight against the crisis needs global cooperation. The World Health Organization, despite all the criticism of Trump, does a good job, an important job, and we have also other things. So my point would be, and then I close, we have multilateralism, but the current multilateralism is in favor of capital. It's free trade agreements, it's the WTO and others. And what would be smart, good, plausible, convincing initiatives to have a newly progressive multilateralism. UNCTAD, for example, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, always a bit progressive, much more progressive than WTO, they started an initiative of a global Green New Deal, which would mean to have really effective mechanisms at the global level to reduce inequalities, to reduce the competitiveness, to reduce free trade agreements and others. And here I would say one very important initiative, a global initiative, would be to really allow countries of the global south to get rid of foreign debt. Because foreign debt is part of austerity politics, and foreign debt will increase, and it's very important to criticize this and to convince governments and international financial organizations to release this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ulrich. So I took note of a few points you both brought up that we could return to in the discussion. Maybe Christoph, something caught your ear that you'd like to bring up at this point?
Yes, very short. I think, Uli, thank you very much. I do agree with the most important points. I would emphasize that it's very important first to try to make interventions in this. It's very important to intervene in the struggles which are going on, and there are always, I agree, there are opportunities to argue for more transparency, to argue for the solidarity, and so that's a very important point. And particularly your last point, but also your last point makes me a little bit more, I'm a little bit more concerned on this. I hope you are right, but I'm concerned about, because there's a tension between the point two, I guess, what was this point of deglobalization and the quest for a new emancipatory solidarity in multilateralism, because this is actually the most important point. If we have this deglobalization at the moment only in favor of some specific countries, we have a strong nationalist deglobalization, and we need to fight for more solidarity in deglobalization. I think this is the major challenge, and it depends exactly on the outcome of such struggle. I think it's not structurally forgiven. It's something that is dependent on the struggles and the power relations involved. And this is also the point with this everyday life. I agree that it is an opportunity, particularly to put more emphasis on what is really necessary for a good life for all. For example, the health care and the care system, the health system, the care system, and so on. Some people realized that it's not only about making money, it's about also the social conditions of living together. And I hope that people in some countries realize that it depends very much on how this is organized and what are the alternatives. But as you see at the same time, look at the US. The US is the most disastrous because they have no security systems, no health system, no welfare state. And we see what people are thinking there. They're going in the totally wrong direction. Many people, I don't know actually what is really the situation in the whole country, but you hear a lot of right-wing thinking about that this crisis can only be resolved by having guns, having their freedom at all, having more jobs, whatever it costs, and so on. And so I'm really concerned about what is the outcome of these struggles for solidarity, whether this fight for their own egoism, I would say. So for me, this is the basic part of the struggles, to make use of your ambiguities, which is, of course, very important to focus on this.
Excellent. Yeah, I may also bring up the idea that Gideon Kosov talked about in the talk on social ecology, on cosmopolitan localism, as one kind of idea. And one take is this from the social ecology, and another is cosmolocalism as an actual alternative modality of economic production, of open source design, global and distributed manufacturing and work and such. Just as a note, if you were familiar with the concept, or but one thing that's really, I think, a question for us in the movement, and I can also mention we're running this small reading seminar on the Green State by Robin Eckersley, and yeah, the whole group has been, through this process also of thinking through, the possibilities of the Green State, thinking through the conditions that we are in, thinking of new multilateralism, thinking of these things. Well, in reality, yeah, we're seeing kind of the opposite, as you were saying, and also with the kind of overlay of the authoritarian tendencies that are also very much kind of present in Slovenia. But at the same time, as you said, this crisis, or however we frame it, has sort of reframed or kind of embedded the role of the state and basic services provision, work and reproductive labor. Yeah, but we're not really, no one's really approaching this as an opportunity for political economic innovation, and there's quite obvious reasons why this is not so in the global capitalist constellation. But regardless, maybe we could delve more into kind of the role of the state in this, both as what we're seeing and what would be some steps toward something that we would in good conscience call a green or ecological state.
Just one point, what we can learn, this is why I started with 2019, and that we couldn't imagine that the climate crisis and the more radical climate policies, even acknowledged by the establishment, would put off the agenda so quickly. That the movements themselves, I'm not familiar with Slovenia, but if I look at Fridays for Future, others, there is no automatism. There is no. I would say it's a radical version of ecological modernization, which is within many movements. And what we can learn from a movement which is called Ende Gelände, the end of the lignite, the coal, and so on, is that they understand they need very concrete conflicts, and it's always contested. But this is one point: not ecological modernization, not trusting in a consciousness which is growing within society, which is a debate from the 90s and even 80s, and which was always wrong. Yeah. And at the other side, also for the movements, again, I'm not familiar with Slovenia, but this is my point in Germany and Austria, that many movements do not acknowledge that the state is a terrain of struggle. So the question for the anti-lignite protesters, which is a great thing, is who turns off the company, which is at the end laws, and it's a question of power. It's a question of a decision made by the state, without then saying, oh, the state should, but to see. This was my Poulansian and Gramscian starting point, yeah, and Christoph would say it as well. To look at this ambiguity and that the state itself, it's a structure very linked to capital and to the structural power of capital, but it's also a terror of struggle. And this is very, very underestimated by recent movements.
To follow what Uli just said, I would like to take the opportunity to make an announcement, because the role of the state is something like a missing link in the whole strategic debate, also in degrowth. Because it is the ambiguity, just as Uli just explained. It's a terrain. It's not only an actor, it's also terrain. The struggles are inscribed, we call it, from the Poulansian approach, and it's absolutely necessary for the degrowth movement, but also for environmental justice movement, to address these uncertainties, the ambiguity of the states. To some degree, state is needed to fix some situations, for example, the phasing out of the coal energy. This is something that can only be done by the state, because you need a strong, legal foundation for this. But at the same time, you can't expect so much from the state. So this is something that should be debated, and this is now the announcement in the Degrowth conference as an online conference. We organized a session on this, where we deal, for example, what was also not forgotten, but only at the corner. This is the question of the welfare state, degrowth and welfare. Something that's also was something that's now emphasized by the crisis. How we can protect people, how we can protect vulnerable people. No? And there we will discuss this also. What we can really expect from the state, or how we can approach, how we can reflect on the state in this ambiguity. And this is a strategic element. You know, the whole Degrowth conference is under this topic of discussions about strategies, and the state is a very important element in this much needed discussions on the strategies. So please, because today we can not fully come to an end to this discussion, so that maybe it's an opportunity to come to the session.
Yeah, just add on this, and then Rock, you say when we open up also for other questions. I was 2 days ago invited by the ATTAC Austria, by the so-called Crisis Council, Krisenrat. There were kind of 30 people from many different angles, of course, critical people, leftists, and they try to understand better what is the crisis and what are outcomes. I talked a bit about green capitalism that's still there. It's not off, it's not over with the greening certain strategies of capitalism. But what we discussed also is that we have the Green Party in the government in Austria. And why are they so weak? So you have suddenly one fraction that says, yeah, they just wanted to have power, and it's also a bit of corruption and so on. And others, they don't have an experience of governing. They were out of parliament before, and then they entered again to parliament and directly into the government. But it's very also important, even there are some forces within the Green Party, not the Green Party per se in Austria, but some forces in the Green Party, how they can be strengthened without being naive to say if there are strong enough movements in civil society, then the state will respond in the Green Party. But to have a very conjunctural understanding what is happening within such a government. And yeah, this was I just wanted to mention. The second point, which is always which really breaks my mind, or is very important. If we talk about the state, usually we talk about the nation state, and the nation state gets its room for maneuver in the imperial countries, in the Western countries, not so much in Slovenia, but in Austria and in Germany. It's very clear, out of a competitive world market, out of resources and material flows that flow from the global south and from other countries, and even from Eastern Europe to Germany. So how can we understand the ambiguity to change a capitalist and imperial mode of production and living in a rich country, and how to understand how this imperial mode of production and living is hegemonic within society, and what does this mean for a state, when the state is not just external to society, but it's of course also part of society, it's part of hegemonic structures.
Excellent. I think, Christoph, you opened up the connection or highlighted that, well, the questions of state and also welfare are kind of blind spots currently within the degrowth field. We're very much kind of trying to, raise awareness through degrowth, and what degrowth really stands for. I thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of hear your takes also on the blind spots, but maybe how to even conceptualize the broad field of degrowth, because there is the kind of performative aspect of it, which is in the name. But it's also maybe important to understand it as a hub for different ideas and how they interrelate and so on. But maybe given your background and so much engagement with this, any kind of thing that springs to mind with relation to this.
It's important to realize that degrowth, like the environmental justice movements, and climate justice now, for example, are those movements worldwide who have the strongest pressure on the hegemonic way of life. So this is what makes the very the importance of this kind of movements and this the political positions behind, because they questions the degrowth movements questions something like hegemonic thinking, which was hegemonic for a long time, absolutely hegemonic, and which very much related also to neoliberal globalization. And neoliberal globalization, of course, as Uli also explained in his speech, has there's some crisis of this hegemony, but we need strong actors able to undermine really this hegemonic thinking and to create counter-hegemonic movements. And I think degrowth is, besides the global the climate movements, the climate justice movements are the most, say, radical movements against this hegemonic thinking. And therefore, this is very important that this Vienna conference, we were heavily agreed on this, that they have to focus on the strategic dimensions. And they have several aspects, and I think I'm very much looking forward. I hope this online design of this meetings works as designed, but I hope we have very good discussions there in these online forums.
I don't know if it's blind spots, but things we really should discuss within the degrowth perspective. It changed a bit, but 5 years ago, I wrote an article in a German journal that the degrowth perspective doesn't undermine power, questions of power. Of course, you have the niche perspective, the perspective that growing out of niche, we will have an alternative, but there's also a question of, but what the degrowth perspective underestimates from my perspective, and Christoph already said it, is the question of domination. The question how social relations are also made acceptable, how modes of living, modes of production, modes of thinking are very difficult to be contested, and that the danger is that the degrowth movement and perspective kind of remains in a truth politics of a radical left, which is important enough. I don't want to deny this, but how to make it plausible within society, how to make it plausible, for example, within trade unions. Yeah, trade unions, and this is why we call our conference in Vienna Strategies for Social-Ecological Transformation, and the trade unions and the Chamber of Labor is on board. They are co-organizing this conference. And what we want with them is not to say degrowth means disruption of the economy, but a radical change by design and not by disaster. Now we have a radical change by disaster. And I would, my first point would be that this perspective of domination, or Christoph said hegemony, is a bit underestimated. The second aspect, and I wrote a book on this with Alberto Acosta, an economist from Ecuador. It's published only in German, Portuguese, and Spanish, where we try to link the alternative debates in Europe on degrowth and on the buen vivir, the good living in Latin America. But at the analytical level, this is about the alternatives. And yeah, at the analytical level, my criticism and Alberto's criticism is that the perspective of many degrowth perspectives is very provincial, is very European, and it isn't thought what is happening beyond. Christoph made the point a bit in your first comment, I think. What will happen in the greening of the European economy when the decarbonization will take place, which means at least a doubling of the imports of metal resources. At least Christoph can tell much more about this, which would be a disaster for the resource extractive economies. But this is a very blind spot. So we have fierce struggles. It's not naive degrowth, but it's a very European, a very northern perspective. And what would it mean for the global south, not only as a perspective? Ashish Kothari said this 2014 at the Leipzig conference. The concept doesn't make sense for the global south. I agree fully. But what the process of a degrowization of a social ecological transformation would not only mean for Europe or for our countries, but also for other countries. All the dependencies. This is not thought through. And this is very difficult to think through, of course.
May I add one point? I would totally agree with this last point. So this is a very Eurocentric perspective, but I would argue that maybe this is also an advantage of this, because it could be the strongest argument after the Corona crisis to look for a different way of living. If you find a new understanding of what is very valuable for our well-being, what is very important, I think the degrowth movement has something to say. If you're in these struggles against the hegemony of this imperial mode of living, they can focus on this way of, but it's absolutely necessary, and growth, we can realize is not economic growth is not the only game in town. So it could be very much important for these hegemonic struggles, but I totally agree, we need an exchange across the world regions, and great, if you want to have great global solidarity, and this is a must, I would say, then we have to kind of create this kind of exchange. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So I propose maybe at this stage we take a question from our audience and maybe I can just mention that everyone who's following us right now, welcome to think up of questions that we can pose to Christoph Ulrich. So our first question is from Sasha, and I think it's a difficult one. How do you envision your everyday lives in a degrowth transition? If I just, can give my own take, I think like a lot of the kind of academic discussion around degrowth is very kind of lively and such, but it's one thing to talk about degrowth, talk about post-capitalism. It's another thing to really kind of, this pre-experience or anticipation or anticipatory ontology of kind of degrowth and how that kind of fuels one's own practice or oriented. I think for me, it's been quite a project to even, allow myself to think that an alternative is possible, that I can within the next 10 years, that, the fabric of society has changed and we are living through transition times in some sense. So I think going back to the question, how do you envision your everyday lives in a degrowth transition? I suppose a snippet of an everyday life or an interaction every day.
It's an important question, and of course we can talk about it in extensive time. But I would answer with an anecdote. You're right, or Sasha was right. If you have only this normative assumption that you should degrowth your desires and your wants and so on, that maybe this is not so important. But after the crisis, this is the anecdote. Yesterday, somebody from my institute approached us to say, we should reduce our workload. We should go down. We should not have the same productivity. We should look about what is really important in working together, in living and working together. And this is a discussion which can lead to something like a degrowth. For example, with this was already also mentioned before, this foundational economy, that we can learn from the crisis. Some institutional dimensions of our societies are very important, for example, healthcare. But we have to decide on what we need, what is really important, and what is maybe more challenging and maybe undermines well-being more than it stimulates well-being. And this could be, of course, a discussion where we can go to degrowth in a way that it is not only a normative pledge or something like this.
Yeah, thank you also for the question. I have 3 points, 3 thoughts. It's not very elaborated. The first is, because I discuss it very much with Christoph, my life will remain stressful because, in a good sense, because I consider myself as part also of social struggles. Of course, we should reorganize the academics and the criteria of recognition and to do less in the thing of third-party funding, but I would say not stressful in the sense that I could do a bit less, but it's also a decision to be part of a society in the making. And this means for me, if I would calculate my weekly working time, now it's very different, of course, that I travel a lot to give public talks, which does not give me a lot of recognition, academic recognition, but it's important for me to do this and to go to local groups and so on. Christoph always says it's too much, and I acknowledge this, but it's an ambiguity I would stick to. The second aspect is, if we talk about our everyday lives, and Christoph already mentioned this, we talk about the conditions under which we live our everyday lives, and the conditions are the everyday economy, as Christoph said. I would even say a different social division of labor. Why isn't thinkable, but not as my decision? I don't know, it's recorded, I don't mention this. I just started the initiative, but it was denied by my rectorate. I can imagine to have in my contract 30 hours and to have 3/4 of my salary, when it's a clear decision that more jobs are created. Not that I gain less, I gain enough, this is not my point, but I gain less, but I do the same work. I have the same workload. So my point is, in the old idea of Marx, of the third, if you like, Feuerbach thesis, it's not only the emancipation of the individual, it's social emancipation. It's the social conditions we are living in. So what would be in our field? What would be an emancipatory academia? And this is not my decision, it's a decision of the conditions. And I would say I would be part of it, in the sense I would reduce my salary and my working time, but as a process that others also can do the job and are, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you so much. So little snippets into everyday lives. I like it. So we have a couple of more questions coming in. And you, Ulrich, just mentioned radicalizing academia in some sense. We have a question from Sarah. How can we contribute to bringing degrowth out of the academic field and more into the society?
Christoph, would you?
I would argue, from my perspective, it's both. This is an academic or scientific approach, but it's even more, I would say, approach from different social movements. It's not only one degrowth movement. The degrowth movement is more a coalition of very different movements, and there's a strong exchange between these movements, and the success of the international degrowth conferences belongs very much on this public interest from different social movements. So I would say it's important to better link the academic discussions with this public discussions. Very often in the conferences, that was not so good resolved. How we can better integrate the scientific perspective and the political discussions, and also artificial discussions already, arts discussions on how we can imagine different futures and so on. So there are several impacts. But I would say we can increase this, but it is more maybe also in a public discussion, political discussion, than only in academic.
I fully agree. And there is a very, very good website from a group from Leipzig, Konzeptwerk Neue Ökonomie, and they set up a project which is called Degrowth in Movements. In movement means that degrowth as a process, but also degrowth within social movements. And they have, I think, 36 entries: climate justice, feminist movements, post-extractivism, and so on. So have a look. It's called Degrowth in Movements. You find it easily, and the S is in brackets. And the second aspect, I would say, if a consent beside others is that degrowth means to get rid of the capitalist growth imperative, which is organizing society, everyday life, subjectivities, production, modes of living, then you can see in other spheres, like in trade unions, debates on that. They won't use the word degrowth because degrowth means for them it's on the back of the workers. Only, let's say, very few people refer positively to the concept, and we have debates all the time. But if we use the content and not the term per se, I would say it's growing, it's expanding, or whatever. Yeah. I'm very much agree, because we had the same debate around 2014 when we had this huge conference in Leipzig on degrowth, 3,000 participants. How can we get out of the academia? And I would say in Austria and Germany, we were a bit successful to do this and to really integrate it into further debates.
Thank you so much. And if I just add my 2 cents, I think one thing that I've also been working on, pretty excited about, is the prospects of participatory foresight in futures and other methods like this geared towards civil society, public participation, but also multi-stakeholder dialogue and such, precisely around the conflicts between growth and degrowth, as these pseudo-hegemonic discourses kind of wiggling about, or commons and neoliberalism, or however it's framed in particular places in the world, to co-design and play with new protocols to kind of pool knowledges, ideas, so kind of civic media and particular design interventions or methods of participation, I think will be key in kind of a wider, broader societal movement, not necessarily, as we said, coalescing around degrowth per se, but the content behind. We have another question here by Micha. For the majority, growth equals prosperity, luxury, comfort, whereas degrowth is seen as moving away from this. What's your opinion on this, and how to convince society to wish for degrowth?
Yeah, I think this is the challenge. That's as Julie just explained. The capitalist accumulation imperative, the need for growth in the capitalist societies, is organizing all our way of living and also our desire. We can't imagine a future without growth. And this is actually the challenge. I would say this is first in hegemonic thinking. And if you go deeper, if you go closer to our own desire, we can realize this is not always the case. We know from research also on life satisfaction that, for example, monetary income is not the only important game in town. If you have increasing income, it is only to some degree also leads to higher feeling of well-being. But if you have higher income, it doesn't matter. So we have a lot of knowledge about this, how that can work. The question is for me more how we can get a new framing in society that this degrowth is something that is thinkable, that it is not forgotten. For example, as you, Rob, just mentioned, also the influence scientific back from the degrowth movement. For example, there will be a session in Vienna about climate scenarios. Some colleagues have realized that in these climate scenarios, degrowth, non-growth, non-economic growth is not even seen as a possibility. So we have to open up this transdisciplinary approach to make the scientists aware that it maybe is an option. And now we have this reality that we have in some sectors of society. We have a strong degrowth by disaster, of course. Yeah. So this is something that should be thinkable in society. So that must be thinkable because it's a reality, and how we deal with this. Now, so maybe the perspective change a little bit. That could be a discussion in the Vienna conference whether this crisis gives us it's not only that the flights collapsed. This is that we maybe recover very soon. But we think about, is it absolutely necessary to think in growing flights? For example, in autumn, the Berlin airport will open, but the Berlin airport depends on planning where you have a strong increase in flights. Maybe we have now thinking about how we come to these scenarios. And can we question this scenario thinking as a more participatory approach?
Yeah, I agree, and I have 4 brief thoughts. The first is, Christoph already also mentioned it, when when it comes to the studies of people, most people subjectively want a stable life and a stable income. And the public discourse is very much on growth and on better and well-being. But if we look at the environmental consciousness surveys in Germany of the German Environment Agency, it's done every other year. The last one is from 2018. There is a huge percentage within society. They don't want to grow in the sense. They want a stable life and a better life in a sense, but not to grow. The second is linked to this, to have a discourse, also a public discourse. Growth is mainly for the rich, the capitalist growth. The capitalist growth is for the corporations, for the managers. We see now in the bailout discussions in Lufthansa, it's for the shareholders. And coming back to the flights Christoph mentioned, only 4% of the global population flies. And even in Germany, it's 35%. In Austria, it's 30% of people who fly once a year. But then you have people who fly more often. You have people who fly 300 times a year. They have a kind of an everyday, they commute every day. And the so-called democratic argument of the cheap careers, the Wizz Air and so on, it's not for the poor people, for the workers who want to afford a flight. It's for those who fly very often. And for them, it's even cheaper. The third aspect is to have good examples. I like very much the work from Harald Welzer, the Future 2, the Futur 2 Foundation, and they try to tell stories. Something it's a bit naive, but I think it's quite interesting. They tell stories. How will we have lived? This is Future 2. How will we have lived in the year 2030, and how we will look back to the year 2020 or 21, and to highlight the positive examples. And the fourth aspect is what in science Christoph also mentioned, psychology, is what we call the citizen action gap. And this comes back to the political conditions. Many people say, I would change even consciously my everyday life, but only if other people do it as well. I don't want to be the stupid who starts to not to have a car or not to have some luxury, if you like. But if there is a clear announcement, and this we can learn in the current crisis, a clear political announcement, the automotive industry has to reduce within the next 5 years its production by 50%. It's not thinkable, of course, currently in Germany. But if this would be the courage of politics to say the bailouts are linked to a reduction, to a logic, to an entry of a degrowth logic, or let's call it a social-ecological logic, but not for the individual consumer. The individual consumer says, I'm not stupid because my neighbor, he has every other day a new car, every other year, I'm sorry, SUV or whatever. And I think this is very important also for the degrowth movement, and even for Fridays for Future, the climate justice movement. Of course, the different individual behavior is very important. It's a learning process. How can we get rid of this desire Christoph mentioned of to have more and to have the more fancy stuff? But it has to be linked with the social conditions we are living in. Just to finish, we know from mobility studies, most people who change from car to public transport don't do it due to ecological reasons, but they do it because they have a good offer, a good, fast, affordable transport, public transport. Then they are willing to change, and not because they think, oh, now I want to be more ecological.
Thanks so much. And just to add to that and round back to the question, there's this slogan, right, within the degrowth movement, something going in the lines of it's not less, it's different, right? And that's a very important point. But at the same time, we have this societal, socio-ecological challenge in front of us, where at the level of, epistemology, it's seeing these connections and institutionalizations of forms actually going through this framework as a framework. I think we have a lot of challenges in front of us, but as Christoph also said, a lot of movements behind the degrowth name or other names. It's spreading, it's coalescing. So I think that there is some grounds for careful optimism, but at the same time, agency, right? Our own agency and our say and what happens in the world. And we have we have two more questions here in the stream, but yeah, I would like to ask if you would like to continue, or shall we put it a close in? Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's running out of time, so we are a little bit late.
Yeah.
So if there are important questions, we cannot make another round up. But then I think we should think about an end to limit ourselves.
Of course, yeah. Let me just go through them quickly. Okay, what are specific capitalist structures that you think have to be unmade to create space for a degrowth transition? That's opening up a pretty big Pandora's box.
Yeah, it's a very important question, but a very big question also.
Yeah. And
we speak about this. One thought of this, because I'm thinking, of course, the structural power of capital is enormous, but what we can also learn as an experience is that the massive devaluation of capital is possible. Of course, it might lead to a more authoritarian capital, but it's quite interesting that the state, and in these conditions, can devaluate massively capital. And this was not thinkable at an experience a half a year ago. I wouldn't underestimate this. It's, of course, we have new capital fractions. I have to think through it, but if there is a new fraction of white capital, because Ursula von der Leyen talked in Die Zeit, in the German weekly, on of a green deal and a white deal. The white deal means, of course, to the health system, to improve the health system. And I can imagine that the Bill Gates and also are waiting for a kind of a white capitalism, a capitalism which is really pushing this health surveillance, the pharmaceutical industry and so on. But my first point was to respond to the question. We can learn that there is, in certain moments, a devaluation possible. And this is why I think the bailouts, the struggle for bailouts and the conditioning of bailouts is now very, very important.
Thank you so much. And yeah, looking at the last question, I think it works very well as a conclusion to our talk. I may take some liberties in twisting it a little bit to fit the purpose, but it's from Sarah, and it goes, do you think Extinction Rebellion contributes to socio-ecological transformation? And if yes, why? And maybe we could extend that to the broader climate justice movement, and maybe also some advice that you might have for younger activists kind of engaging with these fields, many of them for the first time, but some, of course, also not.
Oh, this is a difficult question. I'm not so familiar with Extinction Rebellion, but
Christoph, I can start and you might add.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and then you have the final word also. There is a criticism of a well-developed, and I think it's also right, of Extinction Rebellion and also parts of the climate movement, also of Fridays for Future, that they they estimate very strongly the ecological dimension, the destruction, and underestimate the social dimension. And I think what we can learn, and it's even strong in Fridays for Future. And I also will share an anecdote. I was last year at the summer camp, the summer school of Fridays for Future in Dortmund in Germany, which was quite big, and everybody was still curious what is Fridays for Future about. And I had a panel discussion and also 2 workshops on Imperial Mode of Living. And I was really surprised that you have obviously at least 2 fractions within Fridays for Future. And they self-term them as green economy, that we don't have time to think about capitalism. We have to do alliances with the economy, with management to green the economy. And you have, of course, also a fraction of a critique of capitalism. We have to change the structures. And my point was that you should not, this tension should be made productive. And it should not be a point of a division of Fridays for Future within Fridays for Future. But my argument was, if you want to exist, and if you want to be successful in a medium scale, you have to link the social and the ecological question. And the social question is not in the social at the distribution to get people with us, but to really think in the social structuring of the ecological crisis, which was Christoph's argument at the very beginning. And Extinction Rebellion doesn't do it. They don't do it. And I would say within the Fridays for Future movement, you have still this tension. And this is why I would insist the climate movement should name itself a climate justice movement, because then you really get in the social and the ecological question.
Okay. The last part of the question was more about, is there an advice to social movements and people in social movements? I'm hesitating. I worked on social movements since my dissertation, that means more than 30 years ago, and from a perspective of the critical theory of the so-called Frankfurt School. And I learned over the time that the very good thing of social movements is that they cannot be predicted by social theorists. So in the social movement, something happened, but we can also call spontaneity. There's a spontaneous protests. And for example, Friday for Futures, nobody realized Fridays for Futures before. So this is something that gives me hope, that there are young people engaged in an issue, reflecting on their experience, being involved and becoming an actor as a collective. And this is something that you can't predict. So this is a point that makes me hesitating to give advice. It's more about exchange. Of course, our understanding of how society works and what are the dangers also of social movements, it's an important point, but only in a discussion. I would never say this should be the strategic line social movements should follow. No, I would only engage in be carefully about the state, because there's ambiguities, as Uli explained. So, but not what they should do. And the reflection and making a reflection, reflecting their experiences is an important point. Not only activism, of course, also activism, but also reflecting the experience and therefore taking note of the critical theorists, the critical social theorists that can be applied in a reflection of the experiences, but not as an advice, but to in the future.
Thank you so much.
This is the reason why I mentioned that I went to the summer school. Yeah, it's a good point, because the summer school creates the space to reflect commonly.
Yeah, this is important.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. So I think that's about it. Well, we'll give it a wrap. I would just point out
together for a beer.
Not an online beer, no? If only a glass of water, sorry.
So I would just like to point out to people that today we're also having a protest, which is, well, officially starting in about 20 minutes. We have Mladi za podnebno pravičnost, are also one of the co-organizers here. And yeah, it sometimes seems with the current political constellations that we're kind of stuck back in the 70s with the whole debate of environment versus economy, with some recent tries of the government and such. But I think, yeah, maybe there's some underestimation of just how much strength there is in civil society and connections. And hopefully, yeah, with this action today and similar ones in future, and with reflections and talk like these, we can really make change.
Good success and good luck of your protest in the evening.
Thank you.
Also from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting us. Have a good time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.